Hi, I'm Michaela Rausch. This is the History of Christianity, and today it's time to talk about who, outside of each other, that the Catholics and Protestants strongly opposed during the Reformation era. That's right, today we get to talk about the Anabaptists. As you may know, Facebook and Twitter are fraught with sensationalism, and while these platforms can provide contexts for engagement in civic discourse, they're not exactly known for their nuanced and thoughtful conversations about religion. But if you think that our contemporary religious discourse is problematic, wait until you hear about 16th century Europe. So during the time of the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic and Protestant reformers disagreed about a lot of things, but they generally agreed on one thing: infant baptism. You do it. Partially for religious reasons, like inducting your child as a member of the church, and partially for civic reasons. There's an assumption in Luther's world, and for everyone outside of the Anabaptists, of sacralism, the idea that there ought to be a connection between church and politics. So the Anabaptist rejection of infant baptism was seen not only as a problem within the religious sphere, but also a challenge to their society's sacral connection between church and state. For this reason, and many others, both the Catholics and Protestants believed that the Anabaptists were agents of chaos. But let's look at things from the Anabaptist perspective. Granted, the term Anabaptists is an overly broad term that groups together a lot of people with very important differences, but they shared at least one general belief and practice in common. They believed in the practice of believers' baptism. They believed that the practice of infant baptism was inconsistent with the ideas of the Protestant Reformation. Like, if you're supposed to be saved by grace through faith, they felt that you needed to be able to express a genuine profession of faith before you get baptized. So they proposed waiting to baptize one's children until they were able to give that informed profession of faith. This is actually where the name Anabaptist comes from. It means rebaptizer. Of course, to the Anabaptists, they weren't actually rebaptizing anyone because their first baptisms as children hadn't meant anything. So the term Anabaptist wasn't generally used by the Anabaptists themselves, though perhaps adopted later. It was a derogatory term used to denounce their doctrine. In addition to the Anabaptists' rejection of paedobaptism, or infant baptism, they also rejected their Catholic and Protestant counterparts' insistence on a sacral connection between church and state. Instead, they believed in and promoted the idea of a free church that would not be controlled or beholden to the state. This may not sound like a radical idea to us now, but this was a big deal back then. So much so that by the year 1530, only 5 years after the start of the Radical Reformation movement, 15,000 Anabaptists had been executed on counts of sedition and heresy. That's right, you could be executed by religious and state authorities. In fact, by 1529, Charles V had become so concerned about the perceived threat posed by the Anabaptists that he ordered their wholesale execution. Talk about harsh. But do you want to know the most savage part about these executions? Guess how they were executed? By drowning. Do you get the connection? Oh yeah, it's brutal. Anabaptists were commonly executed by being given their third baptism. The Protestants and Catholics who executed them would say, "Oh, you like being baptized so much, well, we'll baptize you again to death." So they were tied up, dunked under the water, and held there until the Anabaptists drowned. In short, Anthony Arthur writes in his book, The Tailor King, that their opponents of whatever persuasion agreed that the Anabaptists threatened the unity of the family, the stability of the state, the structure of all religious institutions, and the divine injunctions of God. But what made the Anabaptists particularly dangerous was their unshakable conviction that the world was about to end soon, in the bloody second coming of Christ, as foretold in the book of Revelation. Initially, Melchior Hoffman, the so-called Anabaptist apostle of the North, and a gentle soul who must never be blamed for the events that would follow, declared that all the signs indicated that the second coming of Christ, the most significant miraculous event since the birth of Christ, was going to happen very soon, and it was happening in Strasbourg in 1534. Following Hoffman's imprisonment and subsequent death, his followers changed the designated site of the second coming from Strasbourg to Munster, and the year from 1534 to 1535. It's the events which took place in Munster that provide important context for understanding why Protestants and Catholics alike had such a strong negative opposition toward the Anabaptists. For it is likely that the response had more to do with the threat that these people perceived the Anabaptists represented than it did with the Anabaptist theological belief and believers' baptism. But how big of a threat did they really pose? Individualistic and scattered across the northern European landscape, most Anabaptists demonstrated a commitment to nonviolence. They were not so much dangerous for their numbers as they were for the power of their message. Anabaptists spoke of a pure restoration of the original church and its vision of Jesus Christ welcoming them to a certain future in heaven. But among them, however, were those who believed in the redeeming power of revenge, retribution, and violence. Wherever those figures appeared, Anabaptism went on to justify the suspicions and concerns shared by those who viewed them as disruptive and even satanic fanatics. Such proved to be the case in Munster, Germany. At the time, Munster, Germany was one of the few places in Europe that Anabaptists were able to live relatively undisturbed. And this was the same city that an Anabaptist by the name of Jan Mathis believed was going to be the New Jerusalem. Quickly upon this declaration, Anabaptists began to flock to the city. By February of 1534, the Anabaptists abandoned their religious toleration and pacifism and forcibly removed the Catholics and moderate Protestants, anyone who wasn't an Anabaptist. The morning after the expulsion on February 28th, the fog lifted from the moat around Munster to reveal that barriers were being erected around the entire 3-mile circumference of the city, beyond the range of the Anabaptists' cannons. And beyond the barriers, there lay dozens of white-walled tents with the bishop's crest dangling limply from their peaks. The regional bishop, Franz von Waldeck, had put the city of Munster under siege. This drama would last for nearly 2 years. During that time, Jan Mathis took control over Munster, and he claimed to have direct revelations from God. At one point, there was a claim that the Lord had revealed to Mathis, better known as the prophet, that he should don the armor of battle and go forth alone, as David had done against Goliath, to slay the giant beast that was the bishop and his army. Come high noon on Easter Sunday, Mathis was to set out to engage in lone combat with the bishop's army. Everyone in Munster knew of the heroic forthcoming challenge by the prophet to the prince bishop, and all who could be there thronged to the city walls to watch on April 5th. They watched Old Man Mathis, in full armor wielding lance and sword, guide his horse toward Miller's Hill. A few dozen or so members of his honor guard accompanied him. Then a regiment of 500 knights from the bishop's shock troop rose from behind Miller's Hill, and upon the signal, they charged. The pathetic challenge ended within minutes. Mathis, the prophet, was slaughtered, and his severed head was paraded around for the onlooking Anabaptists to see before being stuck on a pole and planted in front of the city. As if that wasn't gruesome enough, one story reports that Mathis's genitals were later nailed to the city gate from whence he left. But the rebellion in Munster did not die with Mathis. Rather, following Mathis's death, his disciple Jan von Leyden took over leadership, and it was under his charismatic direction that the rebellion grew more intense. The fact that Jan could easily twist his mentor's failure into his own triumph says a lot about this unusual young man's nature and force of character. His intuitive mastery of the technique known as the big lie stands out above all of Jan's qualities. The big lie is so absurdly implausible that no one could possibly invent it. It draws on some higher power, and its effectiveness depends on the successful employment of a sincere tone to a people in desperate need of comfort. In other words, one tells the big lie in such a way that the people hearing it assume it must be true. And no one has ever more effectively employed this technique than young Jan von Leyden. Now, the Prince Bishop von Waldeck failed to take further action following the swift execution of Jan Mathis and his accompanying men. Instead, his soldiers passed the time by mocking and insulting the besieged. For example, one night as a dig against the new Taylor prophet, some of the soldiers tacked up a pair of worn boots with a note requesting their mending. If that wasn't childish enough, another young soldier amused himself by going to the same location day after day to moon the Anabaptist forces. But the childishness wasn't reserved for the Prince Bishop's forces, and in fact the radical reforming defenders got even more creative. For example, the Anabaptists purposefully allowed a horse-pulling cart with a wine cask to get intercepted by the bishop's soldiers, knowing that when they opened the spigot, an unstoppable torrent of liquid manure would flow forth. And as for the soldier who dared to bare his bottom in the same location day after day, they blew him to pieces with a coordinated burst of cannon fire. Meanwhile, within the walls of the city, Jan von Leyden set out to deconstruct what remained of Munster's civil governmental structure. But in order to accomplish this, he felt he needed to put on something of a performance for the people. So one morning, Jan decided to appear in the market square entirely naked before a curious and gathering crowd. After a short speech, he raced through the streets, still naked, mind you, until collapsing in a heap, mute and gasping. After being brought inside, he explained in writing that he'd been struck dumb for 3 days so that he might properly receive the vision that God had for what lay ahead for Munster. Apparently what laid ahead for Munster was the institution of a new constitution, and according to that constitution, a number of crimes were now punishable by death, including but not limited to blasphemy, attempts to flee, impurity, slander, idle conversation, disputes, and disobedience to the commands of the elders. Of course, no one was able to pass even a day without being accused of committing one of these crimes. So in essence, every citizen's life was forfeit, and it was only Jan's mercy that was able to spare their lives. How merciful indeed. Not unlike his predecessor, Jan van Leyden used force and fear to govern and foster devotion for himself. But his authoritarian hand often got him into trouble, as did his unbridled passions. By this point, so many of the Anabaptist men in the city had died that the women actually outnumbered them. And so for this reason, and for other less than practical reasons, Leyden decreed polygamy to not only be acceptable, but mandatory. And so the women there were lined up and required to be inspected. Girls as young as 10 years old could be married off to men that could have been their grandfathers. And if women should refuse divorce or marriage, they were threatened with imprisonment or worse, beheading. Jan himself ultimately took a harem of 16 wives in total. Near the end of his reign, one of his wives, Elizabeth Wansheer, rebelled against his authority and criticized his lavish lifestyle. What was his response, you ask? He not only beheaded her in the cathedral square, but proceeded to dance around her headless corpse in front of a singing crowd. So based on the details you've heard so far, you can probably understand why so many have cast the Anabaptists as freaks of fanaticism. Largely because of that which took place at Munster, the Anabaptist reputation was permanently stained in the minds of European leaders. Those leaders went on to persecute Anabaptists anywhere and everywhere they resided, all because of the assumed threat that these Anabaptists posed to society. After all, they'd say, if this is how they act when they take control of a city, we better not let them get a foothold in our city. Now again, it's important to remember that when we use terms like Anabaptist or Radical Reformation, we're referring to wildly diverse groups of people all lumped together, and it can be problematic to treat them as one indiscriminate body. The umbrella term in that sense ends up unfairly encompassing gentle, religiously tolerant pacifists with those who were genuinely threats to society and needed to be stopped. And that explains why Anabaptists during this period experienced such intense persecution. We need not follow suit. For that reason, it's important to break down terms like Anabaptist and Radical Reformation movement into their component parts and recognize how these represent a spectrum of voices all in this Radical Reformation movement. This allows us to understand, on the one hand, why the magisterial reformers were at times frustrated and concerned with the actions of the radical reformers. On the other hand, it helps us to sympathize with those who were frustrated and concerned with the magisterial reformers for the way that they treated some of these Anabaptist groups. Considering this spectrum is helpful because it will give you a more nuanced understanding of the Anabaptists and help you talk about them in a more educated way. After all, it's possible that the magisterial reformers responded so negatively to the Anabaptists not because they were that against believers' baptism, but because of the threat they feared that the Anabaptists posed to society. It was less about believers' baptism and more about them espousing extra-biblical divine revelations, political violence, or both. So because of that, believers' baptism became a symbol for those who were either doctrinally in error or represented a real civic threat to the status quo. The Munster Rebellion tainted the Anabaptist movement, and it fueled suspicions against all who taught believers' baptism, all Anabaptists. In conclusion, although the Catholics and Protestants considered themselves to be as diametrically opposed as two sides could be, they were all the while secretly united in their hatred of the Anabaptists.